the difference between, say, something like scanning, which is simply very popular in football, and decision making. So I think that's a misconception that scanning is decision making. I think scanning is part of decision making. There's a lot more to decision making than scanning. And in fact, most of the interesting aspects of decision making are not so much in scanning itself. It seems to me that people think that seem to associate, like, the more you scan, the better decision maker you are, and they give you models of players that are good decision makers. But I don't think that the amount of scanning, so that people measure the amount of scanning per second or the amount of scanning per minute or something like that, amount of scans, and there's a lot more to decision making than that. So scanning, I would say scanning is gathering information. That's basically what scanning is. So then there's a lot of questions related to that. One of the questions is, where should you scan? What are you looking for? When should you scan? And does more scanning equal better decision making? The two aren't the same. Like, more scanning, more information. So one of the first actual decisions that you have to make is, do I need more information? And that's a decision that has to be made. If that decision is no, I don't need more. If the assessment there is no, I don't need more information, then scanning isn't going to help you, right? So there are many examples where too much scanning can actually be detrimental. Too many examples, maybe not too many examples, but there's certainly cases where scanning, when you didn't need to, or under certain circumstances, is detrimental. So I think that's we can't sort of just say scanning is always the best option, because it isn't. Obviously, I think it's more prevalent that, especially with young players that don't scan enough, or less experienced players that they don't scan enough, but it can go the other way as well. One of the richest sources of information is the ball, right? So if you're looking at things other than the ball, then you could well be missing out important cues and important information about the ball, how the player addresses the ball, what the player is planning to do, which you can often see by looking at the ball. So if you're looking away from that, then potentially you're missing a lot of information, right? So that's why I say the first decision you have to make is whether I should scan, whether I need more information, and whether the information that I get from scanning is going to help me in what I want to achieve. Right? And if it doesn't do that, the scanning, then maybe it's detrimental. It can be detrimental to scan. So yeah, so both of those, I think. So there's a point where not all information adds value. Maybe is another way to put it. So like you said, if you're scanning and you don't need that information, then you're potentially losing out on information because you're not looking at other things. Like, for example, it might be better at some point just to look at the ball, right? And you're too busy sort of checking your shoulders, right? And then you miss some important cue from the player with the ball, for example, right? That he's about to kick it, or he's about to change direction, or that he's looking down, or that he's looking up. And they're all important cues, right? You know, what his body shape is doing and things like that. They're all important cues that can have a very big impact on the situation as it unfolds. But if you're too busy doing this, then you don't see it. Right? Or it might be a case that when you're busy doing this, the player has decided to pass you the ball. And then by the time you look, it's all of a sudden, if the ball wasn't perfect, all of a sudden you have to make an adjustment, and you're late on that adjustment because you were busy checking your shoulder when there was no one around you, right? I think there's a lot more to, like I said, there's a lot more to decision-making than scanning. And in terms of what you said about misconceptions, I think it seems I think a lot of coaches now are pushing this idea that the more you scan, the better a player you are, and the better your decisions will be. And that's not necessarily the case. From my perspective, the starting point for a coach probably should be their model of the game, how they understand the game, right? So, and what they consider as important. So what is important in the game, and I suppose what is important in terms of achieving the objectives that the coach wants to achieve. As a team, every team has their objectives. The coach usually plays a large part in defining that. So the question is, well, what exactly are you trying to achieve? And then the question is, as a team, as a coach, what you're trying to achieve? What's the role of scanning? What's the role of decision making? In terms of that, so that can differ as well. If you're a development coach, then your probably approach is going to be very different to if you're a professional coach, where you're in a competitive environment and the objective is really just to win. So they're all different aspects, but then that influences what you want your players to do. So I think as a development coach, your priority is for the player to develop better skills in decision making, right? And these can take a lot of time depending on the age group of player, the age of the player. So if your players are under 10s or under 12s, obviously you're trying to put the player in an environment where he's exposed to many decisions, and he improves through practice at making those decisions. on the other extreme, if you're a professional coach and you have a very detailed tactical plan, then I suppose the objective is for the player to develop, to use their judgment to decide how to best execute the plan that has been implemented or given to them by the coach. They're sort of different. One is trying to instill the player in general decision-making principles, understanding the issues involved in decision making. The other one is more trying to get the player to exercise good judgment on how to follow an existing plan. And sometimes those are in competition, right? Because a player's judgment may be in conflict. A player's better judgment, if we can call it that, may be in conflict with what the coach wants them to do, right? And I think this is a real issue with players that they've been told what to do, but they have something else. But the situation they see in front of them dictates that they do something different, and then all of a sudden they're in a conflicted situation, which is, do I do what seems right to me in that situation? Is this, and how does this sort of fit with what the coach wants me to do, right? And I think that has a whole bunch of broader consequences. So one of the things is invariably, you hear a lot of coaches say that we're interested in the process rather than the outcome. And that's, I think that there's merit in that thinking. There's also the risk in that if you completely divorce the process from the outcome, and your process is giving you bad outcomes, then you're going to have problems, right? So there's this saying by a guy called Edward Deming, who said, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, then you don't understand what you're doing. I think people interpret that the wrong way, which is, if I have a process, then I understand what I'm doing. And that's not what that line is saying, right? What that line is saying is, if I have understanding, then I should be able to express as a process. Not because I can express something as a process, I have understanding. You could have a really bad process, right? But it's a clear process to you, it's just really bad. That means you don't understand what you're doing, but you have a process, and you might be asking your players to follow that process, or you might follow that process yourself, right? So they're very different things. And I think all of a sudden, I think there's this trend, certainly at least here in Australia, there's this trend, because that is a quote that was given in the coach education system. There's a trend for people to just come up with processes, and they think that everything's right. And then invariably, when things aren't working out well, what do you do then, right? So I understand everything because I have a process. It's like, well, no, maybe you just got the wrong process. You don't really understand what's going on. So I think that's a difficult one, because there's also merit in you have to be careful with any complex environment, football being one, football matches being one. You can't control everything, and you're always likely, there's always the possibility that you're going to get bad outcomes, even though you do all the right things. Because you can't control everything. When things are complex, you can't control everything. So if you do the right things but you get a bad outcome, then as long as you've done the right things, then you shouldn't let the outcome affect your decision, right? You can make a good decision but get a bad outcome, is what I'm saying. The problem is that if the decisions you're making based on the process or the methodology you have is consistently getting you a bad outcome, then there's a flaw with the process, right? So you can't completely divorce the process and the outcome, because ultimately the outcome should evaluate your process. You can only evaluate your process in terms of the outcomes, with the understanding that individual outcomes may not necessarily reflect that. So then you have to really assess your process, not just on one or two outcomes, but some systematic way of over many outcomes that you would evaluate your process. And I think that's one of the difficult things in football, that it's hard to evaluate a process. So if you come up with you have a certain plan that you want to implement, or a certain style maybe that you want your football, let's stay away from style, a certain plan, a certain strategy, and you try it and it doesn't work on the weekend, does that make it a bad plan? Is your process flawed? And the truth is, you can't answer that, right? You just don't, because like I say, you may have, due to factors outside of your control, you may have got a bad outcome in that instance. So then it becomes an issue of, well, at what point can I evaluate whether this is a good outcome, whether this is a good process or not, based on the outcomes, right? And that's a difficult one in football, because so the next time you implement that plan, if you implement it against a different team, your circumstances are so different that it's really hard to then compare that plan against the previous team with the same plan against a different team, right? So I think football is one of these things where it's sometimes what it's called a wicked environment, where there is so little regularity in terms of the time frame that you have to evaluate things. It's almost impossible, or it's very difficult. I won't say that. Maybe that's too extreme. It's very difficult to really be clear about whether the process that you're following is a good one or not. And that makes it very difficult. And this sort of speaks to the judgment and decision making of a coach of, well, I've got this idea, it sounds good, but does it work, right? And I think that's the constant challenge for football coaches. That is very, very hard to make that judgment in a football environment, given the immediacy of the demands of football, especially at the competitive and professional level.